The wine glass sat untouched on the marble sideboard for 3 hours after Madame Elise Beaumont stopped breathing. Servants passed it a dozen times, clearing dinner plates, folding linens, banking the fire in the salon hearth. No one reached for it. No one asked why it remained. The crystal caught candlelight like trapped amber, the dark Bordeaux inside barely disturbed, a thin film across the surface where something heavier than tannin had settled. When the magistrate finally arrived at 11:30 that night, he found the household staff arranged in the entrance hall, hands folded, eyes down, saying nothing. The glass still sat where it had been poured. He asked who had served the wine. A young woman in a gray wool dress stepped forward. Catherine Moreau, 23 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, hands marked by lie and heat. She looked at him without fear or defiance, only the exhausted patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally ask the right question. The Beaumont residence occupied the corner of Rue Saint-Romain and Rue de la Grosse Horloge, in the oldest quarter of Rouen. 3 stories of pale limestone with wrought iron balconies that had watched the Seine curve past for 200 years. The house smelled of beeswax and lavender water, old money and older grievances. In the spring of 1791, it held 7 people. Madame Elise Beaumont, 48, widow of a cloth merchant whose fortune had survived 3 kings and 1 revolution. Her son Antoine, 26, who managed what remained of the family's warehouses near the port. 2 kitchen staff, a porter, a laundress who came twice weekly, and Catherine Moreau, who had been in service to the household since she was 14. Catherine's room was on the 3rd floor, barely larger than the linen cupboard it adjoined. A narrow bed, a small trunk, a window facing the courtyard where sound carried. She woke each morning at 5 to light fires, haul water, prepare breakfast. She went to bed after 11 once the mistress retired. 9 years of this. 3,285 days, though she had stopped counting sometime around the 2nd year. The routine had worn grooves in her mind, the way her feet had worn grooves in the servants' stairs. Rouen in 1791 was a city trying to remember what it believed. The revolution that had seized Paris 2 years earlier moved more slowly here, tangled in the Norman temperament that distrusted sudden change. Yes, the Bastille had fallen. Yes, the king had signed a constitution. But the cathedral still stood. The guilds still functioned after a fashion, and families like the Beaumonts still employed servants who understood their place. The noise from Paris arrived in newspapers and rumors, speeches about liberty and equality, stories of chateaux burned, nobles fled, priests who refused the new oath hunted into Belgium. The words sounded clean and bright when you read them. The reality was messier, slower, full of compromises no one wanted to name. Catherine could read. Madame Beaumont's late husband had insisted his servants be literate enough to manage household accounts. Catherine had taken to it hungrily, sitting in the kitchen after midnight with a stub of candle, working through whatever books the family discarded. She understood what the revolution promised. She also understood that promises made in Paris took years to reach the 3rd floor of a house on Rue Saint-Romain. The first time Madame Beaumont struck her had been an accident. Catherine was 15. She had spilled tea, just a splash on the tablecloth, during an afternoon when the mistress was entertaining guests. The slap came fast, open-handed, hard enough to snap Catherine's head sideways. Then Madame Beaumont's face had softened immediately into apology. The guests murmured their shock. The mistress dabbed at the stain with a napkin, sent Catherine away with a fluttered hand. Later that evening, she pressed a silver coin into Catherine's palm. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me." The second time was deliberate. By the time Catherine turned 23, she had learned to anticipate the mistress's moods the way sailors read weather. The tightness around Elise Beaumont's mouth in the morning, the way she held her teacup, the pitch of her voice when she called for Catherine. Some days passed without incident, others did not. A burned stew meant a twisted ear. A wrinkled collar meant Catherine's hands held over a candle flame until blisters rose. A letter from creditors meant worse. Antoine, the son, saw everything and nothing. He would enter a room 5 minutes after his mother had thrown porcelain at Catherine's head, stepping carefully over the shards, asking if dinner would be ready on time. Not cruelty exactly, just a kind of practiced blindness that wealthy men perfected early. By March of 1791, the National Assembly in Paris had abolished the old feudal dues, seized church lands, issued paper currency backed by nothing but revolutionary promises. In Rouen, these changes arrived like rain seeping through old stone, slow and uneven. The cloth trade that had made the Beaumont fortune was collapsing. Markets disrupted. Credit dried up. The family's largest warehouse sat half empty. Merchant ships from England no longer willing to risk French ports. Elise Beaumont felt the erosion in her bones. Her husband had died 4 years earlier, leaving her a fortune in property and goods she could no longer convert to cash. Her social circle shrank weekly as families fled to relatives in England or estates in the countryside. The priest she had known since childhood had vanished after refusing to swear the civil constitution oath, replaced by a young man who spoke of citizen virtue in sermons that sounded like political pamphlets. The mistress took her rage out in portions: a slap for cold coffee, a fistful of hair pulled for imagined impertinence. Once, she made Catherine kneel on dried peas for 3 hours because the butcher had sent mutton instead of lamb. The household staff who witnessed these punishments said nothing. The porter, Lucien, was 60 and needed his position too badly to risk dismissal. The cook, Madame Petit, had worked for the family 30 years and perfected the art of useful deafness. The laundress saw only what sheets and chemises needed mending. What would you do, standing in a kitchen doorway, watching a woman twice your size twist another woman's arm behind her back until the shoulder joint cracked? Would you intervene? Risk your own fragile security in a city where work vanished daily and beggars lined the cathedral steps? Or would you turn back to your tasks, telling yourself it wasn't your business, that servants had always lived this way, that the girl must have done something to deserve it? Catherine never screamed. She learned early that sound made it worse. Elise Beaumont fed on fear the way fire feeds on air. So Catherine went silent. She took the blows with her teeth clenched, her eyes fixed on a point beyond her mistress's shoulder, waiting for the storm to exhaust itself. Afterward, she would return to her attic room and catalog the damage in her mind. A bruised rib here, a split lip there, a burn on her forearm that would scar in the shape of an iron's corner. She never told anyone. Who would she tell? The revolutionaries in Paris who spoke of equality had no category for a Norman servant girl trapped in a house with a woman who had perfected cruelty as a domestic art. The priests who might have offered comfort were hunted or complicit. The law that might have intervened recognized servants as extensions of the household, subject to their employer's discipline. Catherine existed in a legal blank space where her mistress's authority was absolute and her own body was an instrument that could be tuned with pain. Catherine started keeping a journal in December of 1790. Not a diary of feelings, but a record of facts. Date, offense alleged, punishment delivered. She wrote in the margins of a household account book that Madame Beaumont had discarded, using ink so faint it looked like shadow. December 3rd, spilled wash water, 3 blows to the face. December 9th, bread undercooked, caned across the shoulders, 12 strikes. December 21st, smiled at the porter, hands held in candle flame, 30 seconds each. She didn't write to remember. She wrote to see the pattern, to transform what felt like random violence into something she could measure and predict. The journal revealed rhythms. The mistress was worse after letters from the bank. Worse on Sundays when she returned from Mass and had to face a young priest whose sermons she didn't understand. Worse when Antoine brought home news of warehouse losses or merchant ships that never arrived. The journal also revealed escalation. What had started as occasional slaps was becoming systematic. By March of 1791, Catherine received some form of punishment nearly daily. Her body was a chronicle written in bruises. The cook noticed, but said nothing. The porter noticed, but looked away. Antoine walked through the house as if he lived alone, his mother and the servants mere furniture that rearranged itself without his involvement. On the evening of March 14th, 1791, Catherine made a decision. Not impulsive, not born from a single unbearable moment, just the logical endpoint of 9 years of calculations. She was going to kill Elise Beaumont. The decision settled in her mind like sediment in still water, heavy and clear. She had no illusions about justice. No revolutionary tribunal would hang a noblewoman for beating a servant. The law that supposedly treated all citizens as equal had not yet penetrated the walls of houses like the Beaumont residence. If Catherine went to the authorities, she would be dismissed as a vengeful liar. If she ran, she would be hunted as a thief, her absence taken as confession of some invented crime. If she stayed and did nothing, Elise Beaumont would eventually kill her, not intentionally, but through accumulated damage, the way a building collapses not from one blow, but from years of stress on weakened stone. So Catherine chose a third option. She would stay. She would serve. She would wait for the right moment. And when it came, she would act with the same methodical care she brought to polishing silver and starching linens. The tools were already in her hands. Poison was not Catherine's first thought. She knew little about such things beyond what servants whispered about rat powders and the occasional rumor of a wealthy wife disposing of an inconvenient husband. But the practical obstacles to other methods were insurmountable. She had no access to weapons beyond kitchen knives, and knives required proximity, strength, surprise. She could not overpower a woman larger than herself who would fight back with the same viciousness she applied to punishment. Stabbing meant blood, noise, witnesses. It would be labeled murder immediately and obviously, and Catherine would hang before the body cooled. Poison offered something cleaner: time, distance, ambiguity. A sudden illness could be anything: bad food, cholera, natural causes. The spring of 1791 brought fevers and digestive ailments through Rouen like annual tides. Half the households in the quarter had someone sick. Death at 48 was not remarkable in a city where medical care was expensive and uncertain. Catherine began reading about poisons the way other women read novels. The Beaumont Library held books the late Monsieur Beaumont had collected, medical texts among them. Catherine would slip into the study when the family was out, memorizing passages by candlelight, returning the volumes precisely to their places. She learned about arsenic, sold openly as rat poison, mercury used in hat making, nightshade growing in gardens, foxglove with its pretty purple bells and fatal cardiac effects. She settled on arsenic for its availability and reliability. The apothecary on Rue de la République sold it without questions, a common household necessity. Catherine purchased it in April, dressed in her best wool dress, playing the part of a competent servant managing household pests. The apothecary wrapped the white powder in brown paper, reminded her to keep it away from food, and took her coins without meeting her eyes. She stored it in her room, hidden inside a cracked teacup at the bottom of her trunk. Then she waited. Not from hesitation, but from strategy. She had learned patience the way she had learned literacy, through 9 years of enforced practice. Rushing would create suspicion. She needed the right circumstances. A dinner when Antoine would be away. An evening when no guests were expected. A moment when the household staff would not be watching too closely. May arrived wet and cold. The Seine rose in its banks. Revolutionary newspapers reported unrest in Paris. Nobles fleeing in disguised carriages. Peasants in the countryside refusing the old tithes. None of it touched Rue Saint-Romain, except as distant weather. The Beaumont household existed in its own microclimate of declining fortune and rising desperation. Madame Petit, the cook, had worked in fine households for 43 years. She was 58, heavy-set, with hands gnarled by decades of heat and cold. She had seen 3 generations of the Beaumont family, cooked for weddings and funerals, knew which dishes the late master preferred, and which made the mistress bilious. She had also watched Catherine's transformation from a nervous 14-year-old to a young woman who moved through the house like smoke, visible only when someone needed her, otherwise fading into wallpaper and shadow. Petit saw the bruises. She saw the burns. She saw Catherine flinch when Madame Beaumont entered a room. Once in February, she had found Catherine in the pantry, holding her left hand under cold water, 3 fingers blistered from being pressed against a hot stove grate. Petit had fetched butter, wrapped the hand in clean cloth, said nothing. What was there to say? This was the way of houses. Servants endured. Mistresses ruled. Speaking up changed nothing except who bore the consequences. Lucien, the porter, was complicit through his presence. He stood at the door when guests arrived. He carried messages to the warehouses. He witnessed the daily operations of a household held together by routine and unspoken contracts. He had been in the entrance hall the morning Madame Beaumont dragged Catherine down the stairs by her hair because the milk had gone sour overnight. He had watched the mistress kick Catherine twice in the ribs when the girl stumbled. He had opened the front door to let the mistress's rage exhaust itself in full view of the street, then closed it again and returned to his post. No comment, no intervention, just the practiced neutrality of a man who understood that survival meant seeing without recording. The laundress Marguerite came twice weekly to collect soiled linens and return clean ones. She was 35, widowed, supporting 2 children on wages that barely covered rent. She noticed blood on chemises. She noticed torn fabric that spoke of violence rather than normal wear. She soaked out stains that told stories she didn't want to hear. When Catherine handed her a petticoat with brown smears that could only be blood, Marguerite scrubbed in silence, folded the clean garment, accepted her coins, and asked no questions. She needed the work. The Beaumont household paid regularly, even as other families fell behind. That mattered more than the source of the stains. Antoine Beaumont existed in a state of deliberate oblivion. At 26, he was handsome in the soft way of men who had never been required to struggle. His father's death had placed him in charge of declining businesses he only partially understood. He spent mornings at the warehouse, Afternoons at the coffee houses where men discussed politics without committing to sides. Evenings at home with his mother or occasionally with a woman whose name he never mentioned to the household. He saw Catherine daily, passing her on stairs, taking meals she served, watching her clear plates and bank fires. If he noticed the bruises, he categorized them as domestic matters beneath his attention. His mother was difficult. Servants were always complaining. These were facts of life like weather and taxes, requiring no examination. The complicity was structural. Everyone in the household had reasons to stay silent. Reasons that seemed valid when counted in coins and security and the daily arithmetic of survival. No one person bore full responsibility, so no one felt responsible at all. The violence became ambient, as ordinary as dust on furniture. On June 14, 1791, King Louis XVI attempted to flee Paris with his family. They made it as far as Varennes before being recognized, arrested, and returned to the capital in disgrace. The news reached Rouen 3 days later. The coffee houses erupted in debate. Moderate constitutionalists who had wanted to preserve the monarchy under reforms suddenly faced a king who had tried to abandon his people. Radical Jacobins called for trial and execution. Ordinary citizens who had sung "Cha Ira" in the streets now wondered what came next. Catherine read the newspapers when the family finished with them. She understood the symbolism. A king caught fleeing, authority revealed as fragile, the old order exposed as a fiction maintained only by consensus, collapsing when that consensus cracked. She also understood that none of it changed her situation. A king arrested in Varennes did not make Elise Beaumont accountable for burning a servant's hands. Revolutionary proclamations about equality did not penetrate to the third floor of a house on Rue Saint-Romain. The gap between revolutionary rhetoric and lived reality was a chasm Catherine could measure in bruises. She heard men in the street shouting about the rights of man. She knew those rights did not include women, certainly not servants. The revolution promised to dismantle old hierarchies, but it was building new ones just as rigid, just as blind to suffering that didn't fit its narrative of political liberation. Elise Beaumont, for her part, greeted the king's flight with despair that curdled into rage. She had been raised to believe in certain orders: God over man, king over citizen, nobility over common, mistress over servant. Each tier supported the next. The revolution was dismantling these supports, and she felt the structure swaying. If the king could be humiliated, what stopped servants from rebelling? If old contracts no longer bound, what kept the household functioning? The mistress tightened control the only way she knew. More punishments, more surveillance. She accused Catherine of stealing, of lying, of laziness. She withheld wages for invented infractions. She made Catherine stand in the courtyard during a rainstorm for 2 hours because a guest's coat had been hung on the wrong peg. The cruelty was not random. It was a desperate assertion of power by someone who felt that power slipping away. Catherine kept the arsenic for 3 months before using it, not from cowardice, but from an abundance of caution. She needed to understand how it worked, how much would kill, how long it took, whether it left obvious signs. She couldn't practice on a person, but she could observe. The Beaumont household had rats. Most households did. They nested in the walls, appeared in the pantry, were a constant nuisance. Catherine requested permission to set poison, received it without questions. She mixed small amounts of the arsenic into bread scraps, placed them in corners, and watched. The rats died within hours, convulsing, frothing, too fast, too obvious. She needed something slower. She diluted the poison further, mixed it with different foods, observed the results. A teaspoon in milk killed a rat overnight. A half teaspoon in meat took 2 days. The animal growing lethargic, refusing food, eventually dying in its nest. That was closer. A death that looked like sickness rather than poison. Catherine made notes in her mind, not daring to write them down. She also researched the symptoms of arsenical poisoning through those medical texts. Stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, all symptoms that could be mistaken for cholera, for food poisoning, for a dozen natural ailments. The key was dosage. Too much brought violent, obvious death. Just enough brought a decline that looked organic, a body failing for reasons medicine couldn't quite name. By late May, Catherine had refined her calculations. She knew how much she would need. She knew how she would deliver it. She knew what she would say when questioned. The only variable left was timing. The opportunity came on June 20th, 1791. Antoine announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to Le Havre on business, leaving that afternoon, returning in 3 days. Madame Beaumont planned no social engagements. The weather had turned warm, the kind of heat that made people stay indoors and drink wine with dinner to cut the thickness of the air. The house would be quiet. Just the mistress, Catherine, Madame Petit in the kitchen, and Lucien at the door. Marguerite, the laundress, had come and gone that morning. The linens already returned. Catherine moved through the day in a state of crystalline focus. She prepared lunch. She beat rugs in the courtyard. She polished silver. At 4 in the afternoon, Madame Beaumont called her upstairs to help unlace a dress. While Catherine worked the stays, the mistress complained about the heat, about Antoine leaving her alone, about the state of the nation, about servants who couldn't manage the simplest tasks without supervision. Her breath smelled of wine. She had been drinking since midday. When Catherine's fingers fumbled a lace, Elise Beaumont seized her wrist and twisted until Catherine felt the joint strain. "Clumsy," the mistress hissed. "Stupid girl. Can you do nothing right?" She twisted harder. Catherine bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. Didn't cry out, didn't plead, just waited for the storm to pass. Madame Beaumont released her with a shove. "Get out. Send Petit up with my dinner at 8. I'll eat in the salon. Alone. I can't bear to look at you tonight." Catherine descended to the kitchen, her wrist throbbing. Madame Petit was preparing roast chicken, vegetables and cream sauce, bread still warm from the oven. "Madame wants dinner in the salon," Catherine said. Her voice was steady. "I'll serve it. You can go home once the dishes are ready." Petit looked at her sharply, sensing something but unable to name it. "You sure?" "I'm sure. It's been a long day. You should rest." Petit hesitated, then nodded. She was tired. Her feet ached. The offer of an early departure was too appealing to refuse. "All right. I'll leave the dishes on the sideboard. You can take them up." At 7:45, Catherine prepared the tray. Chicken arranged on porcelain, vegetables steaming, bread on a small plate, and wine in a crystal carafe, dark Bordeaux from the cellar. She poured a glass, then went to her room. Retrieved the cracked teacup from her trunk. Opened the brown paper packet. The powder was finer than flour, white as bone. She had measured it earlier using a small spoon, calculating the amount needed for a woman of Elise Beaumont's size. Not enough to kill immediately. Enough to start a process that would look, to anyone who examined it later, like sudden illness. Catherine stirred the powder into the wine until it dissolved completely. The liquid looked unchanged, smelled unchanged. She had read that arsenic was tasteless, though some victims reported a metallic bitterness. The Bordeaux was strong enough to mask that, and Madame Beaumont was drunk enough not to notice subtleties. She carried the tray upstairs at 8 exactly. The salon was lit by candles that made the dark furniture glow like embers. Elise Beaumont sat in her usual chair near the window, staring out at the street below. The day's heat lingered, making the air thick. She had changed into a dressing gown, unpinned her hair. She looked older in the candlelight, her face sagging in ways powder and proper lighting usually concealed. Catherine set the tray on the low table, arranged the dishes precisely. Madame Beaumont didn't look at her. "Wine first," the mistress said. Catherine poured from the carafe into the crystal glass, filling it 3/4 full. She set it on the table within easy reach. Her hands didn't shake. 9 years of service had trained steadiness into her muscles, and the decision made 3 months ago had settled all uncertainty. "Anything else, madame?" "No. Go." Catherine left, closed the door, walked down the hallway to the servants' stairs. She didn't run, didn't look back. In the kitchen, she found Madame Petit already gone, the dishes left on the sideboard as promised. Lucien was dozing at his post near the front door. The house was quiet except for the usual sounds: wood settling, a shutter creaking, the faint noise of carriages on the street. Catherine went to her room and waited. She had no way to watch the salon without being seen. She had to trust the poison to do its work. She sat on her narrow bed in the darkness, listening to her own breathing, feeling her pulse in her damaged wrist. 20 minutes passed. 30. At 8:43, she heard footsteps above. Heavy, stumbling. A crash as something fell. Then silence again. She waited another 10 minutes before descending, found Lucien still at his post, now fully asleep. Climbed back to the second floor. The salon door was closed. She opened it carefully. Elise Beaumont sat in her chair, slumped forward, one hand clutching her stomach, the other hanging limp. Her face was gray. Vomit stained the front of her dressing gown. The plate of food sat untouched. The wine glass was empty, sitting on the table where Catherine had placed it. The mistress's eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. Catherine approached slowly. "Madame?" No response. The mistress's chest rose and fell irregularly. Catherine checked for a pulse at the wrist, found it racing and weak. She had read about this. The initial symptoms as the poison attacked the stomach lining, the cardiovascular system. This was the beginning, not the end. The process would take hours. Catherine returned to the kitchen, woke Lucien, told him the mistress had fallen ill, that he should send for a doctor. Lucien stumbled upstairs, saw Madame Beaumont, and rushed out into the night. Catherine went back to the salon, arranged the room to suggest sudden illness, placed the wine glass on the sideboard, wiped but not washed, left the food mostly undisturbed, opened the window as if seeking fresh air. The doctor arrived at 9:30. Pierre Marchand, 62, who had attended the Beaumont family for years. He examined the mistress, noted the vomiting, the rapid pulse, the pallor. "Cholera, perhaps," he muttered. "Or bad food. When did symptoms start?" "Shortly after dinner, doctor," Catherine said. "She ate in the salon. I found her like this when I came to clear the dishes." Marchand gave Madame Beaumont laudanum for the pain, tried to get her to drink water. She was barely conscious. He told Catherine and Lucien to keep her comfortable, that he would return in the morning. "If she worsens, send for me immediately." But she worsened quietly, away from observers. Madame Beaumont died at 11:17 that night, alone in her room where Catherine and Lucienne had carried her. No dramatic finale, just a body shutting down, systems failing one after another until breathing stopped. Catherine was in the kitchen when Lucienne came down and said, "She's gone." The magistrate arrived at 11:30, summoned by Dr. Marchand, who had been called back to confirm the death. His name was Guillaume Perrin, 41, a former lawyer who had adapted to the Revolution's new legal structures by accepting a position he would have once considered beneath him. He wore the tricolor cockade on his coat and spoke of citizen virtue, but his methods were old-fashioned, thorough, skeptical. He questioned each member of the household separately. Lucien first, who described the evening in simple terms. The mistress had dined alone. She had fallen ill. The doctor was summoned. She died. Normal, tragic, unfortunate. Madame Petit next, though she had already gone home before dinner. She confirmed that the food had been prepared with the usual care, that the mistress had been difficult but not ill that afternoon. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Then Catherine. Perrin sat across from her in the kitchen, a notebook open on the table. Oil lamps lit his face from below, making shadows pool in his eye sockets. "Tell me about the evening." Catherine recited the facts. Madame Beaumont had requested dinner in the salon. Catherine had prepared the tray, served it at 8. The mistress had dismissed her. Catherine had gone to her room. When she came down later to clear dishes, she found the mistress ill. What did she eat? Roast chicken, vegetables, bread, wine. And you prepared all of this? Madame Petit prepared the food. I arranged the tray and served it. Did the mistress eat much? I don't know, monsieur. I wasn't present during the meal. Perrin made notes in a cramped hand. Dr. Marchand suspects food poisoning or cholera. Did anyone else eat the same food? No. The mistress ate alone. The rest of us ate earlier, different dishes. Where is the food now? Catherine led him to the pantry. The roasted chicken carcass, the remaining vegetables, bread from the same loaf Madame Beaumont had been served. Perrin examined everything, sniffed at dishes, found nothing obviously wrong. He returned to the salon. Looked at the empty wine glass still sitting on the sideboard. She drank wine? Yes, monsieur. She usually did with dinner. From where? A carafe in the cellar. I poured it into her glass. And the carafe? Where is it now? Catherine retrieved it from the kitchen, still half full. Perrin poured a small amount into a clean glass, held it to the light, sniffed it carefully. Wine. Nothing more. He set it down, turned back to Catherine. How long did you work for Madame Beaumont? 9 years, monsieur. And was she a difficult mistress? Catherine met his eyes. No more than any. A careful answer. Not a lie, but not the truth either. Perrin studied her face. You have bruises on your arm. How did you get them? Kitchen work, monsieur. Hot pots, dropped things. Another careful answer. Perrin wrote more notes. Catherine understood she was being evaluated not just for what she said, but how she said it. Her tone, her posture, the steadiness of her gaze. She gave him a servant's performance, deferential but not obsequious, helpful but not eager, exactly the person one would expect in this situation. Did Madame Beaumont have enemies? I wouldn't know, monsieur. I'm only a servant. Had she been threatened? Were there disputes with creditors, with neighbors? Not that I'm aware of. Perrin closed his notebook. Dr. Marchand will conduct an examination. If he finds evidence of foul play, I'll return with further questions. Until then, the household should remain available. Of course, monsieur. He left at 1 in the morning. Catherine and Lucien sat in the kitchen, the house suddenly too quiet. Upstairs, Elise Beaumont's body waited for morning and whatever revelations it might bring. Dr. Marchand conducted his examination the following afternoon in the cellar of the Beaumont house. He worked with an assistant, a young surgeon named Julien Davout, who had trained in Paris before the Revolution made formal medical education optional. They opened Madame Beaumont's abdomen, removed the stomach and intestines, noted the inflammation, the lesions, the necrotic tissue. Marchand had seen cholera. He had seen food poisoning. This looked similar but not quite right. The pattern of damage suggested irritant poisoning, but he couldn't identify the agent without chemical analysis, and Rouen in 1791 lacked the facilities for sophisticated toxicology. He wrote his report carefully, noting the symptoms, the findings, the possible causes. Death by acute gastric distress, cause uncertain. Possibly natural illness, possibly poisoning, further investigation required. The report reached Magistrate Perrin on June 22nd. He read it twice, then returned to the Beaumont residence. This time he was accompanied by a National Guard officer, a man named Laurent Beauchamp, who wore the tricolor sash and carried a pistol more as decoration than weapon. The revolution had made everyone slightly more official while making actual authority more ambiguous. They searched the house. Perrin focused on the salon, the kitchen, the cellar. He examined every bottle, every container, every dish. He found nothing obvious. The wine carafe held ordinary wine. The food in the pantry showed no signs of contamination. The household accounts revealed declining finances, but no desperate debts that might drive someone to murder for inheritance. Beauchamp questioned the servants again, this time with more edge. He asked about fights, about grudges, about anyone who might benefit from the mistress's death. Lucien said nothing useful. Madame Petit, recalled from her home, offered only confusion and grief. Catherine repeated her story with the same steady precision. "You were the last to see her alive," Beauchamp said, pacing the kitchen while Catherine stood with her hands folded. "I served her dinner, yes. And you poured the wine?" "Yes. Into a glass you say was clean. I washed it earlier that day." Beauchamp stopped pacing, stood very close to her. "The doctor says poison is possible. If someone poisoned that wine, it was you. You had access. You had opportunity." Catherine didn't flinch. "I served the wine Madame Beaumont requested, from the carafe in the cellar. If it was poisoned, it must have been tainted before I touched it." "Who else had access to the cellar?" "Everyone in the household. The door is never locked." "But you poured the specific glass she drank." "I poured from the carafe. Many glasses have been poured from that same carafe. If it were poisoned, others would have fallen ill." The logic was sound. Beauchamp glanced at Perrin, who nodded slightly. They had tested the remaining wine, forced a dog to drink some. The animal showed no ill effects. If the poison had been in the carafe, the dog should have suffered. The poison must have been added to the specific glass, which meant someone had targeted Madame Beaumont intentionally. On June 24th, Antoine Beaumont returned from Le Havre to find his mother dead and his household under investigation. He was grief-stricken and furious in equal measure. He demanded answers. He wanted someone arrested, tried, executed. The revolution talked constantly about justice. Where was justice for his mother? Perrin explained the complications. No definitive proof of murder. No clear suspect beyond vague suspicions. The servants had all been with the family for years. No obvious motive beyond the usual household tensions. He advised patience, further investigation, chemical tests when facilities became available. Antoine was not patient. He focused on Catherine because she had been present, because she had served the fatal meal, because suspicion needed a target, and she was the easiest one available. He accused her publicly in the marketplace, shouting that she had killed his mother. He demanded she be arrested immediately. The accusation could have gone either way. Revolutionary law was still being written, and Rouen's application of it was haphazard. But Catherine had one advantage. The revolution's rhetoric about equality, meaningless as it had been to her situation, now worked in her favor. She was a citizen under the new order. She had rights, at least on paper. She could not be arrested without evidence, without trial, without the procedures the revolution had established to replace old arbitrary justice. Perrin, to his credit, held to those procedures. He told Antoine that suspicion was not proof, that Catherine would be monitored but not imprisoned, that further investigation would continue. Antoine raged, threatened, invoked his family's name and influence. But those carried less weight now. The revolution had redistributed power, and Antoine Beaumont, son of a cloth merchant, had less of it than he assumed. Catherine remained in the house. Technically, she was under observation, forbidden to leave Rouen. In practice, she continued her work, now serving a grieving son who watched her every move with barely concealed hatred. The other servants avoided her. Madame Petit asked to be released from service, unwilling to work alongside a suspected murderess. Lucien stayed only because he had nowhere else to go. The investigation dragged through July. Perrin interviewed neighbors, who offered nothing useful. He examined the family's finances, finding motive only in Antoine's inheritance, which argued against Catherine's guilt. He consulted with Dr. Marchand, who could not be more specific without better chemical analysis. The case stalled, not from lack of effort, but from lack of evidence that could survive scrutiny. In late July, Perrin questioned Catherine one final time. They sat in the same kitchen, oil lamps burning low, the summer heat making the air thick. "You know I suspect you," he said. "I know. The doctor believes your mistress was poisoned. You had the means, the opportunity. What you seem to lack is motive sufficient to risk your own neck." Catherine said nothing. "Unless the motive was unbearable cruelty, unless you had endured so much that death seemed preferable to continued suffering." Still nothing. "If you confessed, the revolutionary tribunal might show mercy. The new laws recognize that servants have rights, that abuse from employers is no longer acceptable. You could claim self-defense, a sort of delayed response to sustained violence." Catherine met his eyes. "I have nothing to confess, monsieur. I served my mistress dinner. She fell ill and died. That's all I know." Perrin closed his notebook. "The case remains open, but without new evidence, I cannot justify arrest." "May I ask a question, monsieur?" "Yes. If someone had killed Madame Beaumont, if someone had been pushed beyond endurance and acted to end their suffering, would you consider that murder?" Perrin was quiet for a long moment. "The law would consider it murder, but the law is imperfect. Justice sometimes exists in the gap between what the law permits and what conscience demands." "That's not an answer." "No," Perrin said. "It's an acknowledgement that some questions don't have answers, only consequences." He left. The case was never formally closed, but neither was Catherine ever charged. She existed in legal limbo, suspected but not convicted, free but not vindicated. Antoine Beaumont sold the house on Rue Saint-Romain in October of 1791. He couldn't bear to live there. not with his mother's ghost in every room and a suspected murderess in the kitchen. He dismissed Catherine without pay, claiming the investigation had tainted her employment. She left with her trunk and nothing else. 9 years of service. 9 years of accumulated bruises and burns. No references, no compensation. Just the freedom to walk away. She found work at a boarding house near the river, cleaning rooms, laundering sheets for travelers passing through Rouen. The revolution continued its spasms of violence and reform. The king was executed in January 1793. The terror began that summer. Rouen sent its share of suspects to Paris for trial. Old scores were settled under revolutionary cover. Catherine kept her head down and worked. She never spoke of the Beaumont household. When other servants asked about her previous employment, she said only that the family had declined and released staff. Most servants understood. These were difficult times. Positions evaporated weekly. Magistrate Perrin died in October 1793, caught in a purge of moderate officials. He was denounced as a secret royalist, tried in Paris, guillotined within a week. His papers were seized and burned. Among them, presumably, his notes on the Beaumont case. The investigation died with him. Antoine Beaumont remarried in 1794 to the daughter of a merchant who still had cash. He rebuilt his fortune slowly through wine trade, profiting from the empire's endless need for supplies. He never spoke publicly about his mother's death, but in private he remained convinced Catherine had killed her. He tried once to have her arrested during the terror, submitting a denunciation to the Committee of Public Safety. The committee ignored it. They had larger enemies to pursue. Dr. Marchand survived the revolution and continued practicing medicine into old age. His notes on the Beaumont autopsy were preserved in his personal archive, a single folder among hundreds. When historians later examined these records, they found his observations about gastric lesions consistent with arsenical poisoning, though he could never prove it definitively. Madame Petit and Lucien both found other positions. Petit worked in several households before retiring to live with a niece. Lucien died in 1800. His last words reportedly about a house on Rue Saint-Romain where something terrible had happened and no one had stopped it. Catherine Moreau lived another 47 years. She married in 1802 to a clerk who asked few questions about her past. She bore 2 children, a son and a daughter, and worked as a seamstress to help support the family. She never returned to domestic service. She never poured wine for anyone outside her immediate family. She never explained why. In her 60s, living in a small apartment in the Saint-Maclou quarter, she began writing, not a confession, but a chronicle. She documented her 9 years in the Beaumont household with the same precision she had once used to catalog punishments. She wrote about the structure of silence that had allowed Elise Beaumont's cruelty to continue unchecked. She wrote about the complicity of witnesses who chose their own security over intervention. She wrote about the revolutionary promises that changed nothing for servants trapped in private hells. She also wrote, in careful, circumspect language, about the decision to act, about weighing options when all options were bad, about choosing violence after every peaceful avenue had been exhausted. She never explicitly confessed to murder, but she constructed a moral argument that made such an act comprehensible, perhaps even justified, within the suffocating constraints of her situation. The manuscript was found after her death in 1838, hidden in a trunk along with the account book, where she had once recorded punishments in faded ink. Her daughter, herself now elderly, read it and made a choice. She burned most of the pages, keeping only fragments she thought future generations might need, to understand how people survived, when survival required becoming someone they would never choose to be. One fragment survived, undated, written in Catherine's careful hand. They will ask if I am sorry. I am sorry for what I became. I am not sorry for ending what would have killed me slowly. The law calls it murder. Conscience calls it something more complicated. I call it the only door left open when all others were sealed. Rue Saint-Romain still exists in Rouen's old quarter. The Beaumont house was demolished in 1864 to make way for newer construction. No plaque marks the spot. No tourist guide mentions the family. But in the neighborhood's oral history, passed through generations of working families, the story persists in simplified form. A servant poisoned her cruel mistress. The revolution was happening outside. Justice was confused. No one could prove what everyone suspected. The servant walked away and lived a long life. Some versions cast her as a villain, cold-blooded murderess who betrayed the family that housed her. Other versions make her a hero, brave woman who struck back against tyranny when no one else would defend her. The truth, as always, sits in the uncomfortable space between simple narratives. What remains certain is this. On the night of June 20th, 1791, a woman who had endured 9 years of systematic violence served her mistress a final cup of wine. Whatever else happened, whatever the legal or moral calculations, that act changed the equation of power in one household. It proved that even the most powerless could, in the right circumstances, reclaim agency through the tools already in their hands. Local historians occasionally stumble across references to the case in Revolutionary-era documents. Magistrate Perrin's brief report, Dr. Marchand's autopsy notes, a denunciation filed by Antoine Beaumont and ignored by the Terror's bureaucrats. These fragments suggest a story, but they don't resolve it. The question of Catherine Moreau's guilt remains suspended in the archive's amber, preserved but not answered. In 230 years, no one has definitively proven she killed Elise Beaumont. No one has definitively proven she didn't. The wine glass, wherever it ended up, gave up no secrets. The body, buried in the cemetery of Saint-Maclou, was never exhumed for further testing. The truth died with everyone who sat in that kitchen and lied to protect someone they barely knew but understood completely. Sometimes late at night, when the Seine fog rolls through Rouen's narrow streets, locals say you can still see a young woman in a gray dress walking the old quarter, carrying a tray that never reaches its destination. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.